Hello, everyone. Happy Friday. We're here with Jael O'Hare for our Gender and Astrology episode. All right, Jael, what do you have for us today?
Based on our conversation last time, I have been thinking more about expanding on the idea of relationality and its role inside of constructing gender identity, meaning we often think and talk about gender identity as just a personal journey that a person goes on, but we don't really acknowledge the other part of gender identity, which is also how other people are receiving our gender identity and their relationship to, yeah, like agreeing, disagreeing, wanting to, all of those kind of things. So then it just turns out today there was a really good piece of bit of gender philosophy news, which is that there's a case in Australia that was decided today in favor of a trans woman who named Roxanne Tickle, who sued a social media app named Giggle, which, yes, the case is called Tickle v. Giggle, which seems not real, but it is. Um,
I like.
who will
It's
win?
gonna
The
make a
Giggles or
great.
Giggles?
It's gonna make a great title on our episode.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Tickles v. Giggles. Um, so the case basically was this app was called Giggle, and it was started by a woman who wanted to create a women's only social media space, not a dating app, but just a gathering space. Um, and the trans woman in question had created a profile for herself, but was kicked off the app, and so she sued for discrimination based on gender identity. And this case has been watched internationally because it's being regarded as a test case for further legislation that would change the laws, probably most places in the Western world, whatever way they decide to use the case, in terms of the fact that sex-based protections have never considered gender identity before. There are some newer laws in places like Europe and here that have specified gender identity as a protected class by itself, but since basically we've been making laws, there has never been a question until now about what constitutes a man or a woman. That's been considered like not necessary to define under the law. So all of our current sex protection based laws don't generally have they don't have a definition of what a woman is because previously we never thought that it was necessary.
Hmm. So tell me the exact case again. So she was on an app, and then what exactly happened?
They because she is a signed male or a biological male or whatever is a trans woman basically. They were like the app was like, this app is only for natal females and you are not one, so we're gonna kick you off.
Ah,
um Yeah. And so she's saying, I've been discriminated against because I am a woman and my birth certificate says I'm a woman and all these kind of things. And the court ruled in her favor. The
wow.
court said, which, I mean, and again, this is a huge deal. This is a super huge deal. I mean, definitely in Australia, it has like direct, immediate impacts on their laws. But again, even though it's not direct because our governments aren't inherently linked, it is providing a precedent, and it's sort of considered a win for transgender inclusion. But the reason the judge decided for the trans woman were basically the idea was that sex is essentially a legal category, and if you meet the legal bar, then you are that sex and you can't be discriminated based on that sex. And then there's a related set of laws that define your ability to identify as a sex basically under the self-ID concept, which is it doesn't necessarily require surgery or other things. I mean, there's some requirements, and again, now that varies wildly, so I don't even want to get into all the variation there. But essentially, the judge was saying, you've done what we established as the rules, like changing your birth certificate and, providing evidence that you've been living as a woman, using a woman's name, using she, her pronouns, etc., for X amount of years. So legally, you are a woman.
Interesting. What is the Giggle app for?
It's like just a social media app
Only
for
for
making
women, though.
friends and I don't know, whatever you do on social media.
Is it like, because I'm wondering, like, it's just social media only for women, though.
Yeah. I mean, it's just so anybody who dates men, or really not even dates men, anybody who's ever been on a dating app that men are also on can tell you that men kind of dominate the situation. There's been a huge kind of scandal rumblings about that in terms of lesbian dating apps in recent years, because at least the US based ones have not barred trans women from being on them. And I've been seeing a lot of folks from the lesbian community kind of talking about ditching. I mean, some people are for it and they're fine, but there's also a lot of people who are against including trans women, because what they're saying is the lesbian dating apps are being kind of overrun, if you will. Or, I mean, again, that's very subjective, but essentially that, like, there are people who feel like having male people, regardless of their gender identity, in a women's only space is leading to a situation where they're kind of just being bombarded by male people. And some lesbians feel like they're not attracted to male people regardless of their gender identity, and don't want to be sexually pursued by male people, again, regardless of their presentation. And so this is like a really like fraught part of the culture war right now.
It harkens me
Yeah.
back to the Michigan Women's Music Festival when they were trying to figure out who could go into the festival. And,
Right.
because it's supposed to be a women-only space, and there's this idea that in women-only spaces, women are protected from male formation people because of, predation and all the things, the traumas that have happened to females because of. So this gets back to our discussion of like why to analyze these things. Is like there's a safety concern here, which is, that a male-born person, no matter of their gender identity and spirit, could do some of these. It's. I guess the
Right.
women-only space thing is like a safe space, according to a lot of women
Right.
theorists, right?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that I've noticed in my own thinking on this and reading on this is that, sort of going back to what I was saying before, the reasons to have sex separate spaces and to protect women from or protect female people from male people in certain spaces is established very heavily, kind of, again, across almost all of time and culture. Like I'm really having a hard time thinking of any culture or time period where there have been zero situations where men and women or male and female people were separated. And because of the sort of like given quality to that, a lot of people I think are struggling in these conversations to come up with good reasons in the moment, because the trans activists who want the other thing to happen have their sort of talking points about, ideology and all these things. But I think, I don't know, I guess I almost don't want to argue it. I think arguing for spaces that for female people that don't involve male people, to me is just a given. Like I'm not saying it should be all things, and I'm not saying that trans women are, like predators or anything like that. I'm not, like, I think we need to like bring back a little bit of the extreme polarity that we go here. Like I think it can be okay to say that like all of history has demonstrated a need in some cases to separate male people from female people. And we talked a little bit about the complications that have to do with intersex before, but what I'm going to get into here in a little bit, I'm going to talk about more about why it's binary, being a man or a woman. And but yeah, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Basically, like, yeah, I think there's a lot of really important reasons to do that, and it really shouldn't be up for debate, but it's becoming up for debate because of this issue. But then people are getting around that issue by saying, well, trans women are women, they're not men, so no difference needed. But they're also saying any man is a woman by thinking they are, feeling they are, and that's the only qualification. So basically, like, that's a wide open door to anybody who basically has the audacity to be like, I want this, then they can have it. And I think that most of us, especially female people, know that if you say to male people, you can have whatever you want as long as you're willing to go after it, like, that's not a barrier.
Right. Well, okay, so it makes me think of this thing where it's like, why is it not okay to have women-only spaces and exclude trans women? Well, it's like because the trans women want to play with other women, whether it be at the Michigan Women's Music Festival or on the app or whatever. Um, and then you could just say, well, why don't we create a women-only safe space and then have the trans people play with other trans people? Like that's what happened with Camp Trans was then all
Right.
the trans people kept camping outside Michigan and like having their own party basically. But that doesn't totally work because there's a lot of people who want to integrate to um makes me think of like deaf culture where it's like there's a lot of deaf people who want to hang out with hearing people, right? Like you can't say like all the deaf people should go to an island and just only hang out with deaf people. There's a lot of them, well, they're like, but I like this hearing person and this hearing person knows a little sign language and I want to hang out in the dominant crowd space, right? So it's like I almost feel like there should be like I'm thinking of a workaround because I'm a problem solver. It's like you could have a space for bio women who aren't afraid of spiritual women joining their bio space like
Right.
but is that a workaround at all, like where we could have another app for people who are like, I mean, but maybe they already do that.
Well, the problem that I have is that the two sides of this are not trans women are always included or they're never included. It's sometimes they're included and they're always included. Those are the two sides. And so the side that's saying that there should be the ability to make a distinction based on sex in some cases doesn't mean necessarily that all trans women will be excluded from everything. But the other side is true where what they're pushing for and what this decision said is that there should be in no difference basically, and essentially what it says is there's just no difference between the sexes at all, and it is a legislative destruction of a binary sex category.
Interesting.
So I personally think, I don't know, and I hate this, it's like like I don't know. I have a lot of compassion for trans women wanting to be included in things, and it's not like I'm wanting to be like, oh, gross, screw all you guys or whatever. But at the same time, I keep having to go back to this thing about the fact that men or male and female people have needed to have separate spaces forever, and that there are reasons for that. And I guess what I would prefer to see in the progression of how we're talking about this is, first of all, to recognize trans people as sort of maybe occupying their own little separate gender categories that are sometimes included with a social gender and are sometimes not included. Or I mean, well, social or sex rules aside, context, I guess what I'm for is a context-based assessment, and for the fact that we're also talking about is like this is Giggle the app or whatever. You can just not use Giggle the app. Giggle the app is not the government. Giggle the app is just a private enterprise. And what they're saying in Australia is you're not allowed as a private citizen to even say, I want to only have women here and make a distinction about that. Someone can now sue you for that. And in Scotland, they just made it a felony carrying a 7-year sentence to misgender somebody.
Dang. Wow, interesting.
So I'm not anti-trans. I mean, I again am trans and want trans people to have rights, but the way that some of these things are happening is actually creating like a very detrimental environment, I would say, for everyone, but women are in particular the losers in this scenario, in my estimation.
Well, they're losers if you look at safety as the only win. I think there is something to be said about the brave spaces, and I think the women who allow trans women in are braver. It's like, be a brave space. Like, I'm with you. I do see where we need the binaryism to kind of allow these safe spaces of like all men, all women. There's places where women are not allowed. I remember my someone I know, a man, went to like this man's weekend. It was like they all get naked and like do rituals. I don't know what they do, like literally, but
right.
They don't want a woman in that sacred male space because they're on this man's weekend or so I think
that should be allowed. I mean, it definitely goes both ways. It absolutely should be allowed, especially like men. I don't know, like I would love to see more men going to men's only retreats and like figuring out how to like talk about their feelings and dealing with themselves and stuff like that. That is important. And it's not like what I want to see is a society that actually does what feminism was trying to do before we got derailed onto this I don't know, gender ideology thing, which was to break down how often and how much social gender roles that are culturally constructed dictate what we can do. So what I would like to see is that there's just a lot more, like, why don't we just always have gender neutral bathrooms and like, or like single stall is what I mean. Like there's a lot of places where I would actually love to see the breaking down of sorting people in gendered ways. And I think that is a way to make life more inclusive for trans people and non-binary people. And for everyone, even for cishet people, don't want to be forced into gendered things either. So I think that's where I would prefer to see the movement in terms of opening things up and integrating things, because I would like to see that. It's not like I'm like saying everything should be severely gendered and only men should go here and or female people and male people should go,
Have you ever heard of structural functionalism?
No, I don't know.
Well, it's just that how something is structured will dictate how it functions. So this, there is something to be said for if there's a women-only space, genetically women-only space, that it has a function it does. It provides a safe space for women to do these things. And as soon as you add a two-spirit, like that would take 0 and 1, like, if we had binary female males and ones, and then you'd add like a 2 into the zeros. It's like changes the structure of it. It's no longer all zeros. It's like a 0, 1 with a 2. Like mathematically, it changes the structure. So now we have a different function. Like as soon as, so I actually agree with you that there are some structures that can handle the disillusion of, well, I don't know, like the bathrooms thing, by changing the bathrooms so they're just inclusive everywhere. It does change structures, like you can't have several people going to the stalls together, or like, I don't know, I just think structural functionalism might be one of the things to add to your toolbox of like, why is this happening? Oh, it's changing the structure of this thing, and we don't have the same structure. As soon as we add a trans person, it changes the structure. And to say like it doesn't change the structure, still a woman, it's like, no, it's a two spirit person. It's two. It's a two. It's not a zero. It's not a one. It's a two. You know, like I
Mhm,
don't
mhm. Yeah. No, that's yes, brilliant. I love that. Thank you for introducing me to that top or concept. Um, yeah, I mean, it's like I think one of the things that's missing for me about what transactivism, it, radical transactivism, broadly speaking, the way that it is sort of happening right now, is that it's oh, sorry, I totally lost my train of thought. What was I going to say? Oh, yes. Eh, Well, okay. I don't know. I did lose my train of thought, but I was going to say another thing, which is that it's oh right, okay. The you one could make a very good case for single stall bathrooms becoming a structural change, right? That would change the structure. But like it's pretty easy to make a strong case for single stall restrooms as being something that just benefits everybody. Like it might require some cost or infrastructure change and take some time to do that. But all in all, like I don't know. That seems like kind of a win. But this it's I guess I'm just saying like things can't or shouldn't be applied just in a blanket way because there hasn't been a good case made yet for why men should always be allowed or males should always be allowed into female only spaces. There is not a good case being made for that. In fact, there's a lot of reasons against that.
know.
So it in terms of specific that and again I'm saying like there should be specific things, not that it should be everything, but those specific things should be based on the reasons why. Like people who are hormonally a certain way and have certain anatomy and etc statistically do a lot more of the assaulting. So when we're in a space where people are supposed to be safe from assault, then we need to exclude the group of people that signifies the thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like, and I guess like, I mean, also, I mean, we need to be able to make rules, and not all rules are like blanket general rules are not going to perfectly match to every single individual person, but that's not a reason to have zero rules. Like, we gotta kind of draw the line somewhere, and there should. I mean, I love to bend the rules, so individual cases should be navigated as they come up, maybe,
yeah.
but to blanket statement say that there should never be any ability to separate by sex, I think is just bad for women
Well,
and everybody.
well, it's bad for men too. I mean, it's bad. I don't know that it's well. It's just it's really something, isn't it? But I will say,
Yeah,
I keep thinking about the bathroom thing and why it's how it's similar and different than this. And I think the bathroom thing is something that could be changed ubiquitously if culture like okay so there's this thing with sign language interpreters, like do you provide them only when a deaf person's going to a show, or do you just provide interpreters all the time, or or a ramp is a good example, like a ramp going up to a building, like for the wheelchair person, like should we only build ramps because they cost money, when there's a person who might be going up the ramp or whatever, or do we ubiquitously build ramps? Well, the there's this idea that you could say that a building without a ramp is actually functionally impaired, right? Like a building
yeah,
without a gender neutral bathroom is functionally impaired because it doesn't have the structure that allows for all genders of people to go to the bathroom. Because it's
right,
like, and so I think from a structural functional perspective, having a structure of a gender neutral bathroom in all buildings everywhere cuts down on huge oppressions for people, and that is something that could be done. Now it might take us 100 years to grandfather that in architecturally. Like I don't think that we're going to get that structure tomorrow, right?
right,
But we could. That's something we could vision for the future, right?
yeah. And again, these are the kind of things that I would like to see people fighting for. Like I'm not just against all things trans people, like definitely not. Very not against all things. But I And honestly, it makes me uncomfortable to have even come to these conclusions because I know it puts me at odds with the mainstream of trans activism and a lot of people in my community. Although the more that I've been talking about this with people individually, I've been shocked that actually the majority of the people that I've talked to about it actually agree with me, but feel like they're not allowed to say that, or are afraid of getting canceled and stuff, which is a legit fear. But yeah,
So let me ask you
so
something. Let me ask you something. Can you imagine a space that's only trans people, like an app that's only trans people and doesn't allow biological males or females? Like, because there could be a purity space for trans people. Like if we're
yeah,
gonna make a
I mean,
structural
yeah,
equivalent, right? Like it's like,
yeah.
is that okay?
I absolutely think it's okay. I mean, my stance on single identity spaces across the board, whether that be racially or everybody from Ohio, I don't know. I think that single identity spaces should always be allowed in the private sphere, so to speak. So like, and maybe even in some public ones, but like the there should be a balance of both, I guess. Basically, like, we should as a society be endeavoring to have the most safe, happy, healthy space, and in my opinion, everything that exists does exist, should exist, and therefore there should be a place for it. And so I think that there is a place for segregated spaces, and I think there's a place for integrated spaces, and hopefully we can societally move to more and more of those places being integrated, but it will never do away with the need for single identity spaces, because that, I don't know, it's just to me it's just inherent. Like, why
So
wouldn't we let that happen?
So it's interesting. Just I'm just trying to fix this with you too, because this is really interesting. Okay, so what if Giggle had an XX space, and then they had a women's space? Would that if they had both of those, and the women's space included all women, spiritually women, and then the
Mm-hmm.
XX place was this like safe space for XX people who don't feel like they want to be with the spiritual women. Like could that
Yeah.
rectify the situation?
Well, I mean, there's a few things there. One is that by compelling Giggle, the app, to have to do that, you're not actually letting them have a space that is single sex, for one. And then number two, the like practical part of that would be like, okay, well, how do we are letting male people on, um so like, who's going to be the gender police now? Like, if there's going to be a separation inside of the app and it's not just uniformly one way, and again, we've changed the definition of what a woman is to be open and very open to interpretation, then I don't know, like, you kind of just, it circles back around. And actually, this is a really, really important part of my particular, I don't know, conclusion so far. I mean, I'm learning new things all the time. I'm ready to change my mind if I see better evidence. But basically, like, the real issue that I have with that, with this sort of like saying that we need single sex things, is because we're not talking about a handful of people who've been on HRT for 10 years, have had full top and bottom surgery, who are completely passable, who are all of these things. Like, that would be a very, very rare person. And in that very rare case, I would probably, if that was the only trans woman or trans man being considered, I might be a lot more, well, I probably would have stayed where I started out, which is being pro integration. But what, and I actually want to do a whole other separate episode on this, but the really important thing to talk about also is how we are using and creating the definition of what a man is and what a woman is. And very importantly, in this case, and just in general right now in the current activism, the idea is, if I think it in my brain, it is so. It is the only, like, body doesn't matter at all. The only gender that matters is the gender that I say that I am in a moment. And that is an incredibly low bar to pass. that I think creates a shit ton of problems. And then now going back to the sort of other more important part of this, which again, if we were still talking about people who maybe from are your classic transsexuals from birth, I always felt like this and and I've lived this way and I just want to live in the opposite sex or the opposite gender, and then that. But the reality is that in the last couple decades or so, we've seen a huge shift from what we have historically and classically understood as transsexualism or transgenderism. And that move is opened up the inclusivity bar or whatever so wide that we are now including people who have psychosis or other different forms of mental illness as a being like basically there are mental illness related roads that could lead somebody to and fetish roads that could lead somebody to wanting to adopt what is currently a trans identity, and that group of people is what's the word, structurally fundamentally very different from what people I think classically think of as the like trapped in the wrong body kind of version of being a trans person. So like that's another thing that I think we really need to talk about too. It's like, I mean, it's similar to people saying pedophilia is a sexual orientation, so it should be included under the homo rainbow. And like basically at this point, we're deciding that we want to be so inclusive that straight people, pedophiles, and people who are suffering from psychosis are in the rainbow family by measure of those things. And that feels like we're getting into dangerous category or territory, you know?
Right. Fascinating, interesting. I'm so glad you're speaking up. And we've been talking today at the Moira Press about spicy pineapples or hot potatoes, which are topics that are not easy to. There's no right way to talk about the topic. Like, and I realize that this gender and astrology show is dealing with the hot potato of gender, which when at the complex level that you're dealing with it is like it's like this grenade issue that's like oh my god, it could just explode. It like now it's exploding on the Giggle versus Tickle or where it's like bam gender, but I think it's so cool that you're taking on the kind of role of allowing the astrology community to have this hot topic discussion. I think, and it may be that we don't even cover astrology every episode, but what we are covering is the complexities of gender. I mean, I think what you're asking here is very developmental theory appropriate and wise, which is saying, can we look at trans people as more complex than just male or female? Like they are a physical layer, they have that spiritual layer, they have like this cultural layer. We see them as all these layers. There's all these layers, and this idea of trying to be like, well, are they a man or are they a woman? Well, it's like they're way more complex than a man or a woman. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like
Well, and
1.756 is more complex than 1 or 0. You know what I mean?
yeah. I mean, and actually, that's a good segue into let's actually talk about a little bit of astrology, at least in a theory way, which is a concept I wanted to introduce because in previous episodes we've talked a lot about the sort of gender flavors of different planets and signs and modes and like how they happen. But I want to introduce a kind of a radical thought, which is that Mars and Venus represent the genders, the gender flavor, if you will, of masculinity and femininity, but they're opposites, but they don't represent a binary. They both rule 2 signs each, a feminine and masculine sign. And like that, looking at Venus and Mars, and then also like especially when we're looking at the planets through this like sort of more modifier lens, we would say Saturn and Jupiter are doing expanding and contracting, and like Mercury is about exchange, or like it's not really a gender itself, it's more of a like a process. So there's so yeah, basically like Venus and Mars represent masculine and femininity, but not men and women. There is a binary in the zodiac, which is the sun and the moon. That is a binary. And moon represents a realized woman person, not the concept of femininity, which is represented by Venus. And the sun represents a realized male person. That because our and like, and I said this before when I was talking about moving along the scale. I'm almost like, do I have that? From the Venus Mars extremely themselves part, into be what it means to be a man or to be a woman in the world is inherently relational, and it's inherently how one has integrated some masculine and feminine traits into being a person. So
Well,
like,
that's brilliant. Like you're saying that the sun and moon are like the binary 1-0, and then the Venus Mars additions to the chart like make it all complex, and like that's brilliant. Like never thought of that.
right. Yeah.
The
And I mean,
professor strikes
like,
again.
yeah, like the sun is the soul and like the light of consciousness, and the moon is the mind and the body, and how the light of consciousness is reflected into the world. So it's also subjective, and it's your point of view.
So does this woman's chart show us anything about what the Giggle versus Tickle case, or should we look at her chart?
Yes, I do. I wanted to also look at the transit chart for this because, yeah. Wait, hold on. Was there one more thing I was going to say about that? Yeah. So, okay, let's get my screen share going. Okay. Oh, all right. Okay. So, can you see my stuff?
No.
Okay, how about now?
Mm-mm.
No?
Wait,
Oh,
now mushrooms.
dang it. Well, it's working for me. It worked in our test run, but unfortunately, well, now I'm back. Okay. I'm gonna try this one more time and then we can do a different thing. Sorry. Start
You're doing great. I
broadcast.
love this show. I love the gender and astrology show. There we go.
Okay, nice. All right. So, okay. Um, yep, I pulled up this oops. That's the headline. This is our person we're talking about, Roxanne Tickle.
Gender
And
identity
this,
cascades against. Okay, so this is her
okay.
chart.
So I pulled up two versions of the chart, and this one doesn't have outer planets, just so we can see there's some really remarkable stuff happening here.
Okay.
So first, I want to talk about this T square, huge deal. So we have Venus, the planet that represents the concept of femininity, in fall in Virgo. And I also want to bring in a little radical idea here as well, which is that basically Venus is considered in fall in Virgo.
Oh, wait, this is the current transits, right? Because I was looking at her chart thinking, gosh, she looks just like the T square that's happening
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, no, sorry. This is the current transits.
Okay.
Because I wanted to examine how the astrology of this moment is like, is it a win for women, for femininity, for like how is it affecting the concept of gender identity, the concept of women, the concept of femininity.
Okay.
So yes, so we got Venus in Virgo, which I mean, first of all, bi-gender planet ruled by Mercury. But Venus is considered in fall in Virgo, which I think is really interesting in the modern era. And there are some radical astrologers who are proposing that it shouldn't rule Virgo, actually. But the thing to think about with Virgo is, to me, the key word there is sovereignty. So if femininity is considered by the Western mind to be in fall in the sign that represents personal sovereignty and a woman who is not owned or beholden to a man, damn, that by itself, in my opinion, is kind of deep. But then it's in this opposition to Saturn in Pisces. And Saturn in Pisces is like, talk about dissolving boundaries and like eroding former structures. Also, everything's in retrograde. That doesn't help. So the eroding of structures is opposing this sort of like Venus in its sign of sovereignty. And then both of those are squaring this Mars, Jupiter, both masculine planets, in the masculine / bigender air sign of Gemini, which also has to do with how we talk about stuff. So this court case just made a determination about eroding the structures of how we talk about femininity and who gets to be a woman.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah,
and
that's
that Venus is also making a quincunx, which is sort of a quincunx aspect is, especially in this case, kind of forcing an adjustment. It has a little bit of the nature of Saturn and maybe also of Mars. And the moon is in Aries, which is obviously the most masculine sign that we have. Also with the North Node there indicating some like ambition and expansion in that department. So we're having very strong masculine energy and like just a shitload of hard transits going to the planet that represents femininity. And then we see that moon is receiving both hard and flowing transits, but the flowing transits are from exclusively male and somewhat bigender signs and planets. So what's flowing, and I mean, I don't know, I actually really like this idea of regarding trines especially as not being totally neutral, but actually sort of forcing a mix, like these things need to flow together. Like they are going to flow together no matter what. Like that's happening. The sextile is a little more optionalized maybe, but again, so then we're seeing a trine between the moon and the sun has Mercury right next to it. And I wouldn't even be surprised if some of this actual decision making was happening while Mercury was in Cazimi. So I don't know. I think that's some pretty interesting astrology, if you ask me. And regardless of whether or not you think it's sort of a good thing or a bad thing, definitely not seeing the moon or Venus in very strong positions in terms of their own where they like to be. And again, from my perspective, it's looking like harmful or negative, especially with that Saturn in Pisces being in the house behind the moon, which, we don't have houses here because we don't have a time, but you can still count houses according to the rules of traditional astrology from places. So if we count from the moon or from the sun, which again also is interesting because you're seeing, well, okay, I don't want to get into that, but so here is the chart with the outer planets, and you can see that Pluto at 0 degrees of Aquarius, another masculine sign, and retrograde, is applying all kinds of influence on the chart, including dealing with transforming the sun, which is like an adjustment to the idea of gender identity, you could say, in this chart, like because we're talking about sun as representing identity in general. And it's also making a trine aspect to Uranus, and Neptune is also at, both Neptune and Pluto are at anaretic degrees. Pluto is at 0, Neptune is at 29 of Pisces. But also Neptune is really strong in this chart because A, anaretic degree, and B, it's in the 12th house from the moon in the sign of Pisces. So like Neptune is doing a lot to help dissolve. And I think also it's really interesting that Chiron is directly conjunct this moon, which I think again highlights the sort of wounding of the concept of womanhood in this chart.
Mm.
Thoughts before I say
Well,
words?
I will say that it's cool on T-squares moments in history, big changes happen. Like, so whether or not we agree with the decision of this, court case, it's really cool that there are movements happening that are like working towards the Saturn and Pisces, which would be a more beautiful vibe for all concerned. I mean, maybe this is a vibe win, even though it's not a structural win. Like maybe you don't agree with the structure that they chose, but it is kind of a win for trans people. Like just on the ethos side of things of like how do people feel? Well, I think the trans people might feel respected or regarded highly through this decision.
I
It's
mean, I think trans people is a short way of saying trans women and not remembering that trans men exist. And that's not lobbied at you necessarily, but um, generally speaking, when we talk about trans issues in the public, people are thinking of trans women. Trans men and issues relating to trans men come up almost never.
I wrote my thesis on trans men. Like I wrote a
No, I know you're awesome. I'm
yeah.
talking about the news,
Okay.
social media. Like trans men
Interesting.
are represented like less than 1% of the time compared to how much trans women are represented. That's, I mean,
I
that's
never
just,
thought of that, but that's so true. You rarely see trans men. Maybe it's because trans men don't scare biomen. Like trans
well, I think
scare
there's
bio.
a reason, and it's misogyny,
Oh, interesting.
because we've inside of this like particular gender ideology we're in it, like within the idea that that you realize you're trans as a woman, like you realize you've always been a woman if you're a trans woman. The idea there is that you can't, like, it's retroactively relevant. That is what a lot of people have been arguing for a long time. It's like if you are like, it's that idea of spiritual gender, that you have like a fixed spiritual gender or something, and then like you find out about it, and then it just is the way, like it just exists permanent, like in a fixed state, which I don't think that that's how it works personally. But the other side of that, which again, ask any trans guy, what's happened is that the math of that was made to protect trans women and to protect the womanhood of trans women. But I've also seen the opposite applied quite vehemently against trans men by saying you've always been a man, you've never experienced misogyny, and you're not oppressed. And you basically are moving from an oppressed appearance to a non-oppressed appearance. So shut up and, like you're fine.
Well, then we
Which
could talk
is
about
just
short.
not.
We could talk about short oppression then, because short people are more oppressed. That- So, well, I'm serious. Like one of the things,
I mean,
a really good trans friend of mine, a trans man, is like he and I talk a lot about that. Is like, it's not that. I mean, he like transitioned and now he's male, but he's a short male, which is not like is its own form of oppression. You know what I mean? Like it's like I do
sure.
we could look at like layers. I mean, it's just so complex, the whole thing. It's
Yeah.
like, and yeah, and would say some trans people have more oppressed charts than others too. Like
Oh,
more
totally.
sensitive to oppression than other trans people.
I mean, so again, going back to this like gender ideology thing, which is separate. So when I talk about gender ideology, it is
Here,
a
stop the share so we can
political.
see you. Here, stop the share.
Okay. Yes. Okay. I'm like, do I know how to do it? Okay, there we go. Wait, I'm still not here. Oh, video's off. Okay. Sorry, everybody. Okay, there we go.
There we go.
Crap, what was I just talking about? So when I'm talking about trans activism, I'm really talking about a very particular type of trans activism that comes from the academy and that comes from postmodern gender ideology. Basically, when I'm shorthand talking about that, I'm not actually just talking about any and all trans people being like, please don't kill us and can we have rights. I'm specifically referring to this ideological movement, which is a political movement, and it has introduced a large number of people who are included in what was formerly a very, very rare, tiny group of people because they're included for ideological reasons. So, like, saying that non-binary people are trans as much and as a transsexual person is trans is a way, because the number of people who use they them pronouns or feel like they're not 100% masculine or feminine vastly outnumbers the amount of people who go through medical gender transition.
Well, interesting.
Like, by a lot. And also, interestingly, did you know that only about 3% of women are lesbian only identified? Like,
That I actually believe. I saw something about like that lesbians and bi women, bi is an obsolete term, but have the same behaviors actually. They just have different identities. Like if you look at them behaviorally, but yeah, I mean I think lesbian is kind of an outdated term even. Don't you think queer is kind of the new?
I think that it has become culturally uncool, but I've found myself surprisingly being in the camp of that we need to bring it back.
I
Because
love a good lesbian. I'm not allowed to say that, but long-haired butches were my
oh
type, man. When I
God
was single,
bless.
I would go for a long-haired butch, that's for sure.
Yeah, because LHBs are fine as fuck and they're
They,
magical people. Um,
they're like
I'm a
the
big fan.
man equivalent of a tomboy femme.
Yeah, exactly. So but yeah, basically where I'm going with this though is that and this is not, I'm not like being biphobic, I'm not talking about that. Honestly, bi women only expanded it, maybe they like double the category, but either way, um women who are exclusively attracted to other women is the smallest category in sexual orientation. Like there's like 2 or more times more gay men, for example. Like, it's basically what I'm trying to say is that like you're already women, so you're experiencing misogyny, and then you're already this like teeny tiny little group of people. But if you add in everybody who considers themselves queer just politically or because they're non-binary or for whatever other reasons, because they're pan or because they're whatever, that group of people instantly exponentially outvotes the lesbian population. And as a result, what we have seen in the trend of dissolving all boundaries between gender and sexual identity and saying everyone is just either cishet or not,
Mhm.
and that the queer, that's the idea behind queer, and also behind changing the definition of trans from transsexual to whatever, like the queerness of gender or gender sex or whatever. um
We got 1 minute,
it,
so
oh, okay,
give
crap.
us a
I
breathing
have
place.
so many more things to say, but anyways, basically the blending of all of that, what I am saying is the result of that is that our optimism around wanting to blend it all and say that there's no differences is actually just creating an environment where we're no longer accounting for the fact that some people in the community absolutely do have more privilege and access,
Mm.
And those people are just now able to railroad everybody else and make the rules for everybody else. Like, for example, we as a queer community have made the rules for lesbians that they must want to have sex with penises.
Interesting. I wonder
Because a
if
woman
we,
is an idea, and if you're a lesbian, you're attracted to women. So therefore, like, you're a bad person and you're a turf if you are vocally exclusionary sexually of trans women.
wow. Okay, well, we do have
So
to wrap up, but I will say maybe we should do a show on privilege, or, that would be a cool topic.
yeah, I
Privilege
mean,
in church.
honestly, we could do like episode 2 of this because I didn't even scratch the surface
All
with
right,
all
well,
of
you're in
it.
charge. You just let me
But
know
okay,
next week. All right.
appreciate you.
I'm gonna have to actually shut this off because I have to render the video. So it's good to see you, Jael. I'll see you next Friday.
Yep. All right, take care.